Canada is the country everyone thinks they know. They are wrong. Rocks older than all life on Earth. A cliff that overhangs by 15 degrees. A territorial war settled with whiskey. A cocktail served with the real human toe. These are just some of the 25 facts about the Great White North that sound completely made up. Every single one is true. If you are new here, this channel is all about the geography you were not taught. Canada has 62% of all the lakes on Earth, not 62% of the lakes in North America, not 62% of the lakes in the Western Hemisphere, 62% of every lake on the planet larger than 10 hectares, 879,800 lakes in total, more than every other country on Earth combined. This is not a rounding error. It is a direct consequence of the last ice age, when glaciers scraped across the Canadian landmass for tens of thousands of years, gouging out basins that filled with meltwater as the ice retreated. The result is a country that is 9% freshwater by surface area. Bernhard Lehner, the McGill University geographer who led the study that confirmed the figure, put it this way. In Canada, there's no water cycle without them, really. 879,000 lakes, and that's before we get to the rivers. Canada's coastline is 243,042 kilometers long. That is the longest coastline of any country on Earth, and the number is almost impossible to visualize. Here is one way to try. At a walking pace of 19 kilometers per day, it would take you 35 years to walk it. Non-stop, no sleeping. That is longer than most careers. Longer than most marriages. Here's another way. The circumference of the entire Earth is 40,075 kilometers. Canada's coastline is more than 6 times that distance. One country, 3 oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic, and a shoreline longer than 6 trips around the planet. Canada is larger than the entire EU, not slightly larger. More than twice the size, 9.98 million square kilometers compared with the EU at 4.23 million across 27 nations. And yet Canada has roughly 41 million people, fewer than the Tokyo metro area. 90% of this country is essentially uninhabited. 80% of Canadians live within 150 kilometers of the US border, a thin ribbon of population clinging to the southern edge of a landmass that stretches all the way to the Arctic Ocean. The rest is silence. Wood Buffalo National Park, straddling Alberta and the Northwest Territories, is larger than Switzerland. Switzerland is a country. Wood Buffalo is a park. It covers 44,807 square kilometers compared to Switzerland's 41,285. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It contains the world's largest free-roaming bison herd. And it is the only place on Earth where whooping cranes, one of the most endangered birds in North America, nest naturally in the wild. It is also bigger than Switzerland. The border between Canada and the United States stretches 8,891 kilometers. It is the longest international land border between any 2 countries on Earth. It has 0 military fortifications along its length, no walls, no watchtowers, no armed checkpoints running its full extent. Nearly 9,000 kilometers of shared boundary between 2 sovereign nations, established by a series of treaties beginning in 1783 and defended by paperwork and mutual agreement. For context, the border between North and South Korea is 238 kilometers long, and it is one of the most heavily militarized zones on the planet. Canada and the United States share 37 times that distance, in peace. And that was just the size. The geology gets weirder. On the eastern shore of Hudson Bay, in a remote stretch of northern Quebec, there is a rock formation called the Nouveau-Adjitup Greenstone Belt. It is at least 4.16 billion years old, possibly as old as 4.28 billion years. Earth itself is 4.57 billion years old. These rocks formed during the Hadean Eon, the first chapter of the planet's existence, when the surface was still cooling from molten rock and the atmosphere was toxic. There was no oxygen. No oceans as we know them, no life of any kind, and yet these rocks were already here. Dr. Jonathan O'Neill of the University of Ottawa, who has spent years studying the formation, described what they represent. Understanding these rocks is going back to the very origins of our planet. In a separate interview, he put it another way: rocks are books for geologists, and right now we're missing the book on the Hadean. Nuvuajituk would be at least one page of that book. There is one more detail. The local Inuit community, the Pituvik Landholding Corporation, has now restricted scientists from further sampling the site. Pieces of the oldest known material on Earth were appearing for sale online. The most ancient rocks on the planet are now protected by the people who have lived beside them longest. This is a country built on rocks that predate all complex life. Greater Sudbury, Ontario is a city of roughly 170,000 people. It has highways, a university, a hospital, and shopping centers. It also sits inside a crater left by a comet strike 1.849 billion years ago. The Sudbury Basin was originally 200 to 250 kilometers across, one of the largest impact structures ever confirmed on Earth. The impact punched clean through the planet's crust. What remains today is a basin 62 kilometers long, 30 kilometers wide, and 15 kilometers deep, filled over billions of years with sediment, rock, and eventually a city. But Sudbury is not just a crater. It is the crater that trained astronauts for the moon. NASA sent the crews of Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and Apollo 17 to Sudbury to study the impact geology. Because the basin's terrain so closely resembled the lunar surface, the same comet strike that punched through the crust also created the world's largest concentration of nickel deposits. Over a century of mining has extracted more than $100 billion worth of metal from the same rock the comet shattered nearly 2 billion years ago. Mount Thor, on Baffin Island in Nunavut, has the greatest purely vertical drop of any cliff on Earth. The west face falls 1,250 meters, 4,101 feet, straight down, except it does not fall straight down. It falls past straight down. The average angle of the face is 105 degrees, which means it overhangs by 15 degrees beyond vertical. The cliff leans out over the ground below it. Drop a bowling ball from the summit, and it would fall for 20 seconds before hitting anything. The mountain sits inside Auyuituk National Park. In Inuktitut, Auyuituk means the land that never melts. The first team to successfully climb the west face did so in 1985. It took them 33 days, steeper than vertical. The cliff overhangs. Along the shore of Franklin Bay in the Northwest Territories, there are hills that are on fire. They have been on fire for centuries, possibly for thousands of years. The smoking hills burn because of bituminous shale, a sulfur-rich rock that spontaneously ignites when exposed to air through a process called pyrite oxidation. No lightning strike is needed. No human hand. The rock simply meets the atmosphere and begins to burn. Orange and yellow smoke rises from the Arctic cliffs above blue water. The smell of sulfur drifts across the tundra. And it has been happening, without interruption, since before any Europeans set foot on this continent. Near the town of Carcross in the Yukon, there is a desert. Sand dunes, wind-sculpted ridges, exposed, shifting, sun-baked sand, backdropped by snow-capped mountains. The Carcross Desert covers roughly 2.6 square kilometers and is often described as the world's smallest desert. Except it isn't technically a desert at all. It receives too much rainfall to qualify. What it actually is a series of ancient sand dunes left behind by a glacial lake that dried up at the end of the last ice age. The surrounding mountains create wind patterns that keep the sand exposed year-round, even through Yukon winters. So it looks like a desert. It behaves like a desert. It just isn't one, which somehow makes it stranger. But Canada's borders might be the strangest part. 25 kilometers off the southern coast of Newfoundland, there is a piece of France. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, a small archipelago of 8 islands with a total population of around 5,800 people, is not Canadian territory. It is not an independent nation. It is France. Officially, legally, administratively, France. The currency is the euro. The phone code is +508, a French overseas code. The language is Metropolitan French, not Quebecois, not a dialect, but the same French spoken in Paris. The nearest French city is Brest, 3,819 kilometers across the Atlantic. It is the last remnant of New France, the vast colonial empire that once stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay. Everything else was ceded, sold, or conquered. These 8 islands held on. And today, if you take a ferry from Newfoundland and step ashore, you are standing in Europe, 25 kilometers from Canada. Between 1973 and 2022, Canada and Denmark fought a war over a barren, uninhabited Arctic island roughly the size of 130 football fields. No shots were fired, no blood was spilled. The weapon of choice was alcohol. Hans Island sits in the Nares Strait between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. Both countries claimed it, and so began one of the most civilized territorial disputes in the history of sovereign nations. When Canadian forces visited, they planted a Canadian flag and left a bottle of Canadian Club whisky. When the Danish Navy arrived, they replaced it with a Danish flag and a bottle of schnapps. This ritual continued, flag for flag, bottle for bottle, for 49 years. And the Whiskey War did not just end, it created something new. In June 2022, the two countries resolved the dispute by splitting the island, roughly 60% to Denmark, 40% to Canada, drawing a new international boundary directly across it. That boundary, combined with the surrounding maritime agreement, created a 3,962-kilometer maritime border between Canada and Denmark. It is the longest maritime boundary in the world. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly marked the occasion with characteristic understatement. Many have called it the Whiskey War. I think it was the friendliest of all wars. In the northwest corner of Lake of the Woods, Ontario, there is a small piece of the United States that is completely surrounded by Canada. The only way to reach it by road from the rest of America is to drive through Canada, crossing the border twice and showing a passport both times. The northwest angle exists because of an 18th century mapping error. The Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War, drew the boundary using an inaccurate map. By the time the error was discovered, the border was already legally established. As a result, a small jut of Minnesota has remained stranded above the 49th parallel ever since, reachable by land only through a foreign country. Canada's southernmost point is further south than parts of California. Middle Island in Lake Erie off the coast of Ontario sits at latitude 41 degrees 41 minutes north. The northern border of California is at 42 degrees north. That means Canada's southernmost tip extends further south than 27 American states, partially or entirely. It also sits at roughly the same latitude as Rome and Barcelona. The next time someone describes Canada as a frozen northern wasteland, that is worth remembering. The southern edge of Canada is Mediterranean in latitude, if not in weather. Churchill, Manitoba has a polar bear jail, an actual facility, with actual holding cells for bears. Churchill sits on the western shore of Hudson Bay and is known as the polar bear capital of the world. Every autumn, as the bears wait for the bay to freeze so they can hunt seals, they wander through town. Young bears especially, adolescents testing boundaries, looking for food and causing problems. When a bear becomes a threat, local authorities tranquilize it and transport it to the polar bear holding facility, where it is held without food, to avoid conditioning it to associate humans with meals, until the ice forms and it can be released back onto the bay. The facility holds up to 28 bears at a time. At peak season, there are more polar bears in the Churchill area than there are people. Residents leave their car doors unlocked so that anyone caught outside during a bear encounter has somewhere to escape to, an actual jail, with actual cells, for bears. Now for water, because Canada's relationship with water is insane. In the middle of the Saskatchewan prairies, there's a lake where it is nearly impossible to sink. Little Manitou Lake sits about 100 kilometers southeast of Saskatoon. It is fed by underground mineral springs rich in sodium, magnesium, and potassium salts, and the result is water with a salinity several times higher than the ocean, roughly half that of the Dead Sea. Swimmers float without effort. The water holds you up before you even try. It has been called the Dead Sea of Canada. Indigenous peoples used it for centuries as a place of healing. Settlers arrived and built a resort town around it. The mineral content is so dense that the water leaves a white crust on your skin when it dries. One lake, in the prairies, where you cannot sink. Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron, Ontario, is the largest freshwater island on Earth. At 2,766 square kilometers, it is bigger than many countries' entire island territories. It contains more than 100 lakes of its own. One of those lakes, Lake Manitou, is the largest lake on a freshwater island anywhere in the world. Lake Manitou has its own islands, including Treasure Island, which is the world's largest island in a lake on an island in a lake. Manitoulin Island has been home to First Nations peoples for over 10,000 years. Today, it remains one of the largest Indigenous communities in Canada. It is also an island with 100 lakes, containing a lake with islands, on a lake, in a country that already holds 62% of all the lakes on Earth. And if you are noticing a pattern, Canada holds almost everything. On Victoria Island, a landmass in Nunavut in the Northwest Territories, roughly the size of Sweden, there is a lake. In that lake, there is an island. On that island, there is another lake. And in that lake, there is a tiny island approximately 300 meters across. An island, in a lake, on an island, in a lake, on an island. This is not a riddle. It is a verified geographic feature, the world's largest known third-order island, discovered in 2007 not by an expedition or a survey team, but by geographer Josh Calder sitting at his computer, scrolling through Google Maps. He found nested geography so recursive it looks like a mistake. It is not a mistake. Canada simply contains an Inception-level arrangement of land masses and water that the rest of the planet apparently could not be bothered to produce. Canada contains roughly 20% of all the fresh water on Earth. Not just lakes. Rivers, glaciers, wetlands, underground aquifers, 1/5 of the planet's total freshwater supply is concentrated inside a single country's borders. Canadian rivers discharge 105 million liters of fresh water into the world's oceans every second. That is the equivalent of 42 Olympic swimming pools. Every second. One country holding 1/5 of all fresh water on Earth. That's not a coincidence. That's geology on a planetary scale. The Great Lakes, Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario contain 18% of the world's fresh surface water. Not total fresh water. Surface water. The water sitting on top of the ground, visible from above, available to life. Lake Superior alone is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. 82,100 square kilometers of open water. The 5 lakes together hold 22,684 cubic kilometers of fresh water. They are so vast and retain heat so effectively that they generate their own weather systems. Lake effect snowstorms, fog banks, temperature gradients that reshape regional climate across 2 countries. They are visible from space, not as a detail, as a dominant feature of the North American continent. 5 lakes that function less like lakes and more like an inland freshwater sea, sitting quietly on the Canada-US border while the rest of the world slowly runs out of water. The world is going to need this water. Canada has 1/5 of it, and barely anyone lives near it. And finally, the human extremes. This is where it gets personal. The closest permanently inhabited settlement to the North Pole is Canadian. Canadian Forces Station Alert sits on the northern tip of Ellesmere Island, Nunavut, 817 kilometers from the North Pole. It is a military and scientific station, staffed year-round by a rotating crew of between 5 and 80 people depending on the season. In January, temperatures drop to -40 degrees Celsius. The sun does not rise for months. The nearest Canadian city of any size is so far away that Alert is actually closer to Moscow than it is to Ottawa, a settlement closer to the North Pole than to its own capital. Canada placed people there anyway. On February 3, 1947, a weather station in Snag, Yukon recorded a temperature of -63 degrees Celsius. It remains the coldest temperature ever recorded in North America. The surface of Mars averages around -60 degrees Celsius. On that single February morning, a small village in the Yukon was colder than another planet. Residents reported that sounds carried unnaturally far in the frozen air. Breath crystallized instantly. The cold was so complete that the normal rules of the atmosphere seemed to stop applying. Quebec produces between 70 and 77% of the world's entire maple syrup supply, depending on the harvest year. That is not a fun fact. That is a strategic reality, and Canada treats it like one. The Quebec maple syrup producers maintain a global strategic maple syrup reserve, a network of warehouses storing millions of pounds of syrup in barrels, managed and regulated like a commodity reserve. As Simon Trepanier, executive director of the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, explained, "In the States, you have the strategic oil reserve. Mother Nature is not generous every year, so we have our own global strategic reserve." A strategic reserve of maple syrup. In 2012, thieves broke into the reserve and stole approximately 3,000 tons of syrup, valued at $18.7 million. It became known as the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist. Over a period of months, barrels were systematically emptied and refilled with water while auditors failed to notice. More than a dozen people were eventually arrested and convicted. The story was dramatic enough that Amazon Prime adapted it into a series called The Sticky in 2024. Someone robbed Fort Knox, except Fort Knox was full of syrup. At the Downtown Hotel in Dawson City, Yukon, you can order a cocktail containing a real dehydrated human toe. The sour toe cocktail has been a tradition since 1973, when a retired riverboat captain named Dick Stevenson discovered a frostbitten amputated toe preserved in a jar of alcohol and had what can only be described as an idea. The rule is simple and non-negotiable. You can drink it fast, you can drink it slow, but the lips have got to touch the toe. Multiple toes have been used over the decades. People donate them, mostly amputated for medical reasons, occasionally lost to frostbite. Over 113,000 people have officially joined the Sour Toe Cocktail Club. In 2013, a man named Joshua Clark deliberately swallowed the toe, paid the then fine of $500, and walked out. Terry Lee, the club's toe captain, reacted that they were furious because toes are very hard to come by. The fine for swallowing the toe is now $2,500. The toe is non-negotiable. The lips must touch it. Canada is so wide that its east coast is closer to a different continent than to its own west coast. St. John's, Newfoundland, sits approximately 3,370 kilometers from Ottawa, Canada's own capital. It sits roughly the same distance from the coast of Ireland, but the more striking number is this. The island of Newfoundland is 4,270 kilometers from London, England. It is 5,740 kilometers from Victoria, British Columbia. Newfoundland is closer to Europe than it is to the other end of its own country. Canada doesn't just span a continent, it spans the distance between continents. Its eastern edge looks across the Atlantic toward another world, its back turned on 5,500 kilometers of its own territory stretching west to the Pacific. One country, an impossible width, and at its far eastern tip, a rock in the ocean that is, geographically speaking, almost European. A place colder than Mars, a war fought with whiskey, a human toe you can put your lips on for $2,500. This is Canada. 25 facts, all of them verified, all of them real. And honestly, I had to cut another 25 just to keep this under 15 minutes. Canada is not just big and cold. It is one of the geologically oldest, hydrologically richest, and most bizarre countries on the planet. It has rocks that formed before life existed, a crater city that trained astronauts for the moon, a freshwater supply that the rest of the world will one day desperately need, a whiskey war, a toe, and 879,800 lakes that nobody talks about. The version of Canada most people carry around, cold, polite, vaguely boring, is missing almost everything that matters. If you want to go deeper on any of this, why nobody lives in 90% of Canada, what it is actually like at CFS Alert in January, or the full story of the Hans Island Whiskey War, those videos are coming. Every one of these facts is a door. This channel walks through them. If this video gave you something you did not know this morning, subscribe. There is a lot more where that came from.